Good morning, everyone. So today I will be presenting measures to improve peripheral perfusion in critically ill cirrhotic patients. So basically this is a very vast topic. So I will be touching on the important points and updating you. So what is the need for assessment of peripheral perfusion in all the patients who present with shock? Because there may be a dissociation between our macrocirculatory parameters which we routinely monitor, like mean arterial pressure, central venous pressure and cardiac output, and the microcirculation which is present in critically ill patients. And this change in microcirculation is associated with organ dysfunction. Not only that, persistence of microcirculatory changes despite the macrohemodynamic optimization is associated with a higher mortality. And if we are able to assess and early optimize our microcirculation, we may have better outcomes in critically ill patients. So this is the spectrum of clinical shock, in which we see the most common presentation is arterial hypotension and an increased blood lactate which is seen. But some modalities of tissue perfusion may not always be apparent in these patients. We have to actually look for them, like oliguria, altered mentation and impaired skin perfusion. So these are basically our windows to the human body, and they show us other microcirculatory abnormalities which may be present in shock. So this is the normal anatomy of the microcirculation. It consists of an arteriolar end and a venous end, and in between there is the capillary network. And this is the largest organ in the human body, comparable surface area wise, and the functional units are about 100 to 150 microns in diameter. And there are three components: the arterioles, the network and the capillaries. The sphincters are present most commonly in the arteriolar end, and this is where our vasopressors act and they regulate the flow to this capillary network. And it is the capillary network which basically takes part in the gas exchange with the tissues. So in resting conditions, only 20 to 30% of these capillaries are functioning. So there is a term known as the functioning capillary density. So that is defined as a number of capillaries that are traversed by RBCs at a given time. So otherwise the capillaries are in a collapse state and they respond according to your metabolic requirements. Now this is this is a schematic diagram basically of the vessel wall. This is the intravascular portion where you can see RBCs. This is the glycocalyx layer which is present on the endothelium surface. This is the endothelium, and this is the subglycocalyx space which is present, and this is the interstitial fluid. So basically, in the earlier models of which was described by Starling, there was no presence of this subglycocalyx space, and now it has been hypothesized that it is this space and the glycocalyx layer which is very important. It is affected in shock, and it is the glycocalyx layer which actually takes part in the fluid exchange whenever intravenous fluids are given. So the earlier model of Starling had described that the fluid is filtered at the arteriolar end and it is reabsorbed at the venular end. But the revised model tells us that reabsorption occurs throughout the arteriolar and the venous end, and it is dependent on the hydrostatic pressure. So the arteriolar end hydrostatic pressure is more, so the fluid absorption is more, and as we go to the venular end, the hydrostatic pressure is lower, so the absorption is less, but it is still present. And so what are the implications of the revised Starling model for fluid resuscitation? That the capillaries filter fluid into the interstitial space along the entire length and not just at the arteriolar end. And according to the model, the reabsorption of interstitial fluid via the venules does not occur because it is restricted by the subglycocalyx space which has a very low oncotic pressure. And the ultra-filtered fluid which goes into the interstitial space is returned into the circulation as lymph. So the interstitial space is always drained by the lymph and it goes into the vessels, the cava. There are few exceptions to this rule, like the kidney, gut and liver, which have different microcirculations. That was the fluid part. Now we come how oxygen is transported in the microcirculation. So this is the arteriolar end. This is the venous end and this is the capillary flow. So the capillary flow, as we see, is heterogeneous. Because the network is so large, depending on the RBCs which are there, the supply to the tissues is given. Now this is a magnified view of the previous slide. This is the tissue and these are the capillaries on both the sides. So there are two modes of transport over here at the tissue level. One is the convective transport, where the oxygen is carried by the RBCs. So we need good oxygenated RBCs which can go through small capillaries, that is they are able to deform. Second is, after convective transport, this oxygen is transported to the tissues by means of diffusion. So there are two modes of oxygen transport at the tissue level. First is the convective and second is the diffusive. And this diffusion is also dependent on this intercapillary distance. So if this distance increases, we have a problem. The diffusion will not take place or it will be poor. So now we come to clinical studies in liver disease. So microcirculation has been studied a number of times in patients with cirrhosis. We will be discussing a few of these studies. So coming to the first study, which was published in 2010, where the muscle tissue oxygenation and microcirculatory dysfunction was studied in cirrhosis using the near-infrared spectroscopy. 35 patients were studied, in which 25 were cirrhotics and 10 were healthy volunteers. And the NRIS is a modality. Basically, it tells you about muscle tissue oxygenation. So these patients were not in shock, they were normal patients. And what was done was a vascular occlusion technique. That is, a cuff was tied around the brachial artery, it was inflated, and the monitor was applied in the forearm to see the response to the occlusion technique. So what was done? The systolic blood pressure was elevated for 150 millimeter of mercury for 3 minutes, and this was done thrice. So in each time, the response to repeated ischemia was seen. So what were the results? So this is a graph which we see normally after occlusion, NIRS graph which we see after the occlusion technique. So it consists of the following components. This is a downslope which indicates the decrease in saturation once you have inflated the cuff. This is the upslope, which is after the cuff is deflated, we have a exaggerated hyperemic response. And this, again, a small downslope indicates the recovery to the baseline of that tissue. Okay, so now what happened in the study? The gray lines indicate the readings of the cirrhotics and the dark lines indicate the reading of the normal patients. So in the first is what we can see, that NRIS showed that the baseline saturation was lower, tissue saturation was lower in cirrhotics as compared to healthy volunteers. Then the hyperemic response was exaggerated. The recovery to baseline was very slow in cirrhotics. It took a long time to come back to the baseline as compared to normal patients. Second is that the healthy volunteers showed a adaptation to repeated ischemia. On repeated inflation, the fall in saturation was at a higher level. First it fell to 40, then 50, and then 60. So the adaptation was better, whereas in cirrhotics there was no adaptation. They all remained at the same level in spite of repeated, so adaptation was poor in these patients. So this is the same thing in baseline. The baseline saturation was lower in cirrhotics. The upslope, that is the hyperemic response, was more, and the recovery time was poor. This is another study in which this time cirrhotic patients with septic shock were studied and the skin perfusion was assessed. So there were 42 patients and 75 non-cirrhotics with previously reported septic shock. They were used as control. And for 24 hours, every 6 hourly, the following parameters were monitored. Parameters of microcirculation, which was mean arterial pressure, heart rate, CVP and cardiac output, and organ perfusion parameters like lactate, urinary output, the Mottling score, the thinner and the knee tissue saturation. Thinner and knee tissue saturation was seen with the help of laser Doppler. Okay, so out of all the parameters, the best parameter which indicated survival in these patients was the Mottling score. Okay, none of the macro parameters, that is the mean arterial pressure, the heart rate, the CVP or the cardiac output, were predictors of 14-day survival. Lactate and arterial lactate and lactate clearance came close to significance, but the best was the Mottling score. I will tell you in brief about what is the Mottling score. So it basically is seeing the skin discoloration around the knee area, and it is divided, it has 5 grades. So grade 1 is where there is only a cone-shaped lesion on the knee. Second is when the mottling reaches just above the patella. 3 is when the mottling will reach to mid-thigh. 4 is it crosses the mid-thigh but does not reach the groin. 5 is when it will cross the groin. Okay, so what were the further findings was, so a mottling score of more than 1 at hour 6 that predicted death with a sensitivity of 0.6 and a specificity of 1. Here we can see that more than 1, the survival was poor. Now, a change in mottling score. Now we can see 3 circles over here. One are the white, the gray and the black ones. So the gray ones indicate the change in mottling score. So the patients in which the mottling score reduced, that is -1, -2, they came in the group of survivors. So survival was better in these patients, whereas the change where there was an increase in mottling score, the mortality was higher. Second is, even in patients where the mottling score was 0, it was equally distributed. Sorry. There were survivors, and even in patients who did not develop mottling, they also had mortality. So this is another graph from the same study where patients, survivors and non-survivors with cirrhosis. If we compare these two, there are 3 colors over here. The white color is with a mottling score of 0 to 1. The light blue is a mottling score of 2 to 3, and the dark blue is a mottling score of 4 to 5. The bars indicate the proportion of patients, okay, and the x-axis indicates the hours from the onset of shock. So we can see that in cirrhotics, the patients with low mottling, so patients even with a score of 0 to 1, there was mortality, whereas in patients who did not have any liver disease, the number of patients with a 0 score was lesser. So absence of mottling basically in liver disease may not be a very good sign, but the change in the score, if a patient comes with a higher score and that reduces, may be a better indicator of the perfusion recovery in these patients. In the same study, they had compared the knee saturation changes in the first 24 hours. So the y-axis is the knee saturation. Again, the x-axis is the delay from shock onset. Now we can see that the circle, small circles are the patients who are cirrhotics, and the square is the patient without cirrhosis. So we can see that the knee saturation was higher in the patients in the first 24 hours. So the takeaways from this study is that patients with cirrhosis have a higher baseline saturation, which is there even in the presence of shock when you compare with controls. Mottling may be a very delayed sign in these patients as far as if you consider it as a monitor of skin perfusion. This is the laser Doppler picture of the same study where they have shown 8 patients in both the groups. Patients with cirrhosis, there is a presence of skin perfusion in spite of the presence of shock, and in those in non-cirrhotics, this skin perfusion is not present. So laser Doppler showed a higher mean perfusion, a higher maximal perfusion, and there was also a higher heterogeneity of perfusion in the knee area in patients with cirrhosis without mottling. So even if mottling was absent, perfusion was there, but it was highly heterogeneous. And after mottling appearance, once mottling appeared, the perfusion was reduced in both the groups. So skin perfusion was longer preserved in patients with cirrhosis and septic shock, and mottling appearance and the knee tissue saturation decrease were delayed in these patients compared to non-cirrhotics. This is another study, a recent study, where sublingual microcirculatory changes were studied in cirrhotic patients. 31 patients were compared with 31 controls. And the results of the study were, these were patients who were not in shock, that in general patients with cirrhosis have a lower mean arterial blood pressure and they have a higher body mass index. And compared to controls, what they saw was in the sublingual circulation that the cirrhotic patients had a total lower vascular density for all the vessels. For the small vessels, the total and the perfused vascular density, proportion of perfused vessels, and the mean flow index, these were lower in cirrhotics compared to controls. And again, the same finding, the flow was heterogeneous. Heterogeneity was higher in the cirrhotics. And another important finding was that RBC velocity was very high in cirrhotics compared to the control group. So how does this affect the peripheral perfusion in cirrhotics? The heterogeneity of flow disturbs oxygen extraction. High RBC velocity also impairs tissue oxygenation because enough time is not there for exchange between the RBCs and the tissues. And theoretically, the reduction in capillary transit time may not be sufficient to unload the oxygen completely. So now we come to our targets of microcirculation. These are usually our targets or the things which we can manipulate to improve the microcirculation in patients. So basically 3 main parameters: peripheral vascular tone, the cardiac function, and the blood rheology. So starting with peripheral vascular tone, as we know that hypotension is associated with a decrease in the arterial tone, and this decrease in tone not only causes hypotension, but it results in the maldistribution of the blood flow and volume. And the heterogeneity which is there, it always worsens because of the maldistribution. And therefore, whenever we interpret any level of mean arterial pressure, the chronic level of pressure for that patient must be considered. So in hypertensive patients, the level of mean arterial pressure may be even higher than 70 millimeters of mercury. Now, how do we treat the hypotension? First line is fluid therapy. The main aim of treatment is to give predetermined boluses. We have to titrate them to clinical endpoints, mainly the dynamic fluid indices. And usually if the chronic mean arterial BP is not on the higher side, mean arterial pressure of 65 millimeters is well tolerated. Then what is the type of fluid which we should use? Whether it should be crystalloid or colloid. So recent meta-analysis or systematic review has shown that there is no difference whether you use crystalloid or colloid or albumin. The only fluids which are to be avoided are probably starches, which increase the need for blood transfusion and RRT. And otherwise, using crystalloid or colloid makes no difference to the need of RRT or reverse or the mortality basically. So what is a normal response to volume expansion once you give the fluid? Usually in normal patients, there will be decrease in the systemic and pulmonary vascular regulation resistance due to the counter regulation, because there is a reduction in the activity of the renin-angiotensin system and there is a decrease in the plasma renin activity. So normally you get initially a decrease in the systemic and pulmonary vascular resistance after fluid resuscitation. There is an increase in the left ventricular volume and cardiac output. And this relationship between the increase in left ventricular volume by the preload is described by the Frank-Starling curve. But we have to remember that the individual responds to a fluid challenge only if the ventricles are operating in the ascending portion of the Starling curve, which is this. The x-axis is the ventricular preload, that is the fluid which you are given, and the y-axis is the stroke volume which will increase after giving your fluid. So only if your patient is on this part of the curve, he will respond to the fluid. Once your patient reaches here, increasing the fluid does not increase the cardiac output. So what are the caveats of giving fluid? It is commonly seen that critically ill patients who come to the ICU, come to the emergency, only 50% of these patients are fluid responsive. By fluid responsive, we mean that they are on this part of the curve and that they will respond to your fluid challenge. So the rate of response to your fluid challenge is markedly decreased. And since increase in stroke volume, therefore, will not be always a rule in acute circulatory failure, and overly aggressive volume expansion can produce deleterious effects. Now we come to how cirrhotics will respond to volume expansion. So as we know, in liver disease, there is a hyperkinetic circulation. There is an abnormal distribution of blood volume, which I will be describing. There is vasodilatation with a low systemic vascular resistance, which is the normal physiology of a cirrhotic. There is increased whole body vascular compliance and there is increased arterial compliance. So this is the blood volume which is seen when compared to cirrhotics and normal patients. We see that majority of the blood is pooled in the splanchnic circulation. For normal individuals it is around 18%, but in cirrhotics around 25% of the fluid is there in the splanchnic circulation. Whereas if you come to the thorax, it is relatively lower when compared to the normal patients. So now this is basically a picture which is describing the arterial compliance in cirrhotics. So as we go down from the heart to the larger vessels, mainly compliance is measured of the large central arteries. And when we compare control and child A patients, the compliance is comparable. But as we go from child B to child C, they start getting more dilated, the compliance starts to increase. So this is an arterial cross section in which we can see the dotted line shows the increase in compliance, and the solid line is the normal vessel diameter. So in normal and child A patients, the increase in compliance is lower compared to the child B and C. But the lumen is getting smaller because these patients remain functionally hypovolemic. So the ability to dilate is more, but functionally they are hypovolemic. The reason being the blood is pooled more in the splanchnic area rather than in the central circulation. Apart from this, the circulating catecholamines, their plasma renin activity, the aldosterone and vasopressin is already elevated in advanced disease, and the plasma atrial natriuretic peptide may be normal or increased. This basically points toward a reduced effective arterial blood volume. So how do they respond to volume expansion by water or by saline? So response and pattern of distribution in cirrhosis again depends on the severity of the disease. In early cirrhotics, that is in child A patients, the volume response may be similar to healthy subjects. That is, they are able to excrete the sodium load which is administered to them. It might be delayed, but it is there. Whereas in late cirrhotics, they go into sodium retention, and increasing the load of sodium will not result in increased sodium excretion. So this is a picture which is describing the normal patients and the cirrhotics. How do they respond to plasma volume expansion? So in a normal patient, when plasma volume is increased, there is increase in interstitial fluid space, increase in cardiac output, heart rate may decrease, stroke volume may increase, arterial BP, central blood volume increases. Whereas in a cirrhotic, in response to plasma volume expansion, your central blood volume may remain the same or it may increase. Your heart rate usually does not come down. It may remain the same or it may increase. Stroke volume increases, again interstitial space fluid increases. And your arterial compliance, in normal individual, the arterial compliance usually reduces in response to plasma volume expansion, whereas in cirrhotics it goes up. So volume expansion by saline in cirrhotics transitorily increases the stroke volume and cardiac output, reduces the systemic vascular resistance, and causes a plasma and interstitial space expansion. But in cirrhotic cardiac myopathy, cardiac decompensation may manifest and we may have signs of congestive heart failure, including stasis in the pulmonary circulation. So how do they respond to an intravenous infusion of albumin? Similar to saline, it causes a plasma volume expansion initially, and later the albumin is redistributed. But studies have found that albumin is beneficial in patients with post-paracentesis circulatory dysfunction, because it has been found that it helps in reducing the plasma renin activity in these patients. So now this is the response of albumin. This is a graph of a patient who is child A, and this is a patient with advanced liver disease. The dotted line indicates the response after albumin infusion. So as we can see, in a child A patient, after albumin infusion, the rise in BP is very good, or there is the dotted line can be seen above the solid line. Whereas in advanced liver disease, even albumin may not be able to raise the blood pressure that effectively. It is almost merging with the solid line. We may not get a very good response. So volume expansion and severity of cirrhosis. So irrespective of the cirrhosis, volume expansion results in an increase in stroke volume and cardiac output in liver disease. In early cirrhosis, the proportion is similar in both the central and the non-central parts. In late cirrhosis, the expansion is usually confined more to the non-central part, and there is not much increase in the central blood volume. Now, red cells. How do they respond to infusion of red cells? Usually RBC infusion results in increase in portal pressure, and it has been found that if we do a volume by volume resuscitation, this again precipitates the risk of bleeding in these patients. And even in non-bleeding patients, the increase in cardiac output, what has been in cirrhotics, is mainly due to the increase of plasma output, and the output of the red cells usually remains the same. So this is a graph which is showing the increased cardiac output as we go from control, from child A to B to C. The white bars indicate the plasma output and the shaded bars indicate the red cell output. So in spite of the worsening of the liver failure, it is the plasma output which is contributing to the increased cardiac output and not the RBC. So studies have shown that correction of anemia favors, if we correct the anemia, maybe that can favor the systemic circulation more. So cirrhotics are vasodilated and overloaded, but from a functional point of view, they are hypovolemic. So timely volume handling is essential, and the potential risk of a reduction in renal function because of sodium containing fluids should always be considered. So though fluids can increase the perfusion pressure, it is mediated mainly by the increase in cardiac output, and it requires that the vascular tone is not very low. The reason being that patients with a high vascular tone, the increase in arterial pressure is very good, but patients with a low vascular tone, giving too many fluids may not help us in increasing the cardiac output much and the blood pressure very fast. So what do we do? The next step comes is the role of vasopressors. So as we know, the alpha and beta receptors are present in the arterioles, and the beta action helps in improvement of the capillary perfusion, and overaction of the alpha receptors results in decrease in the microvascular perfusion. So noradrenaline is the drug of choice, and which is found to increase cardiac output in patients and reduction in lactate levels. And vasopressin derivatives also behave in a similar way. And usually in the normal, in lower doses, vasopressin and norepinephrine have similar action, but as we increase the dose, vasopressin derivatives may also be associated with the complications like digital necrosis and hypoperfusion. So this is a study which has been done in ILBS, where terlipressin and noradrenaline has been compared in patients with cirrhosis and septic shock. In this study too, the macro diameters as well as the microcirculatory parameters were compared, and it was found that terlipressin is equally good for lactate clearance in patients with liver disease. So optimizing cardiac output requires optimizing of the preload, which is by your IV fluids. IV afterload is by manipulating your vasopressors, contractility and heart rate. Then we come to blood rheology. So what is the blood rheology in liver disease? The erythrocytes are more rigid, the volume of the RBCs is increased, and the plasma viscosity is lower. Then what happens in hemodynamic compromise? So there are 4 types of changes in blood rheology when we see in patients who come with hemodynamic compromise. In type 1, where there is heterogeneity in the capillary density. In type 2, because of dilution, which may be because of hemodilution, there is inadequate transport of oxygen. In type 3, there is stasis in the microcirculation, either because of too much vasopressors, which has constricted the arteriolar end, or too much of fluids, which has compressed the venous end. And type 4, there is too much of interstitial edema, because of which the functional capillary density is low. So now this is type 1 heterogeneity. Type 1 where few of the capillaries are perfused and few are with deoxygenate. So microcirculatory guided strategies would be de-escalation of fluids, use of diuretics, RBCs transfusion, which will help in recruitment of circulation, and blood purification techniques like reduction in cytokine levels, which are associated with improved microcirculation. So circulatory failure basically can be divided into 4 parts. First is the salvage phase, then is the optimization, then stabilization and de-escalation. So my summary for improving peripheral perfusion in liver disease would be: first is closely monitored and guided fluid therapy, which includes the mean arterial pressure, dynamic parameters, which we already have. In addition, microcirculatory parameters like skin mottling, temperature gradient, lactate clearance. Fluid of choice would be albumin or low saline containing crystalloids. avoiding hemodilution, introduce vasopressors early because fluid might not be very helpful. Target map should be more or around 65 millimeters of mercury. RBC transfusion in appropriate cases. Timely de-escalation, diuretics or fluid removal with our appropriate techniques. And extracorporeal therapies can be considered in case of persistent poor perfusion. Thank you.